Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman here in Boca Raton, and I'm sitting here with Bernd Wollschlaeger. He's a doctor, a board-certified family physician practicing here in South Florida, but he also has an amazing backstory, an amazing family history, and he's written about it in his book, A German Life Against All Odds. It recounts Dr. Wollschlaeger's childhood and family growing up in Germany, the son of a decorated Nazi tank commander. Then, unbelievable as it may sound, Dr. Wollschlaeger examined his faith and converted to Judaism. It's nice to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, John.
And here's the cover of your book here, you holding the Torah, your father there with his iron cross around his neck. You talk about how in your childhood you discovered your parents were maybe concealing something from you. Children are curious by nature. What was it that made you kind of keep digging away and to get to the bottom of the story and find out what really happened?
Well, John, I grew up in Germany in the early 60s. And the effect of the war were still visible. We as children knew that the war happened. That's all what we knew. But we as children also knew in the war people win and lose. And the fact that there were about 10,000 to 12,000 American soldiers stationed nearby my hometown in Bamberg, Germany, which were present in the fabric of the German society on the streets, led me to ask questions. And the questions were, what happened? Where were you in the war? What happened in the war? And I already had questions because I had no grandparents, I had no uncles, I had no aunts. When I asked about them, the answer was they were gone. There was the war. So of course I was curious to know. And my parents were very tight-lipped. Until I was about 7, 8 years old, my father started to tell me stories about the war and long walks that we had on Sunday afternoons in the forest. He was an outdoor person, a hunter, taught me how to handle a rifle, how to shoot, a very close relationship with them. And he started to tell me stories, the stories of glory, the knight in shining armor. He, as a World War II tank commander, riding on the tank towards the front, a young major serving under the command of the famous General Guderian, who was the father of the German Blitzkrieg. All glory, blood and glory, the knight in shining armor. And of course, for me, my father was a hero, obviously, and for his accomplishment, he was awarded by his Führer, as he said proudly, Adolf Hitler, a cross, the Knight's Cross. And so as a child, naively, I referred to my father as a hero. I looked up to him. On the other hand, my mother told me a different story about that war, that the war was horror, the war was a catastrophe, that she, as an ethnic German, grew up in Czechoslovakia, and everything that she knew and she valued lost as a result of the war. A wealthy merchant family, everything, business lost, beautiful villa lost, fleeing, nothing, penniless. So two contrasting views, glory and horror. And there were other clues in the house that actually in my own house that I couldn't escape.
Wait, was this a scary process for you as you uncovered more information each step along the way? It had to be concerning the more you learned about the reality of the situation.
You're correct. It was, on the one hand, as a child, I was curious, I'm always curious about what happened and then trying to digest it, but always the question, and then, and what else? And this what, I knew that there was something else. Intuitively, there was something else because they always told me just enough to satisfy my curiosity. But there was something big thing that was missing. And one of them had to do with the house that we were living in. It was a massive 2-story building in downtown Bamberg. And the entire second floor belonged to the landlady. It was like half of a football field, it appeared to me, so big it was. And the landlady, my mother referred to her as the Countess, and I should not speak to her until spoken to. And in the hallway of this massive building was a larger-than-life, for me as a child at least, portrait of a man who looked like my father, painting. And this man depicted an officer in a uniform with the officer's hat, the Knight's Cross around his neck. And I asked my father who that was, and my father referred to him as a traitor. And as a child, I knew that a traitor is a bad word. But how could it be that a man who looked like my father is bad and my father who looked like him is good? It doesn't go together. Until later I found out from the lady upstairs that this was a portrait of her husband, of a former husband, his name was Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was the German colonel who was leading the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944.
And this was an image you saw every day?
And that was an image I saw every day. So how could it be that two men who looked alike did two different things? One, which I learned, resisted the dictator, which I later learned this was a dictator, Adolf Hitler, And the other one, my father, served the dictator. What else is behind? Now that propelled my curiosity forward.
I want to focus in on the Knight's Cross there. You talk about the story where your father was given that award after he was injured in the war. He was given the cross by Adolf Hitler himself. You said he referred to Hitler as Mein Führer, as
his Führer,
as was commonplace back then. So your father still held some loyalty to Nazi Germany.
Well, my father was a purebred German, and he swore an oath, not to his fatherland. The oath that they had to swear was to the Führer. And this oath could only be broken once there was no Führer anymore. And of course the Führer died, Adolf Hitler died. He committed suicide. But for my father there was still an oath. And the loyalty, even though loyalty was in a sense betrayed, because this Führer committed suicide and didn't die in battle. But still my father referred to that as the former authority, as somebody who swore an oath to, and that he felt loyalty. But it was conflicted loyalty, I knew that. But he was very proud that he was awarded that Knight's Cross by the man who was leading Germany at that time.
And clearly believed in the oaths that he gave. Now, did your father talk about Hitler at all? Did he tell you who he was and in terms of a historical perspective? When you asked questions about Hitler, what did your father tell you?
My father referred to him in two ways. First of all, a man who pulled Germany from the abyss, rebuilt Germany, the autobahns, the economic recovery after the depression, following the depression, the rebuilding of Germany, and the war as a way to expand righteously what Germany properly belonged to in the past. And then on the other hand, he told me about the war that he probably went too far, and that the war that was lost, there was a wrong planning. There were ideas behind it that should have been modified. So he was conflicted about that, but he was still stubbornly insisting that there was a righteous goal to wage a war.
I want to talk about the Holocaust a little bit, and you talk about how you asked your father questions about it, and it was simply a topic he was not willing to discuss with you. When you learned more about the Holocaust, was that the moment of revelation for you, that you really kind of realized what your father had been through, and where you kind of had that spiritual awakening?
The Holocaust was a fact that nobody could deny. And in the 60s, I already learned in school that 6 million Jews died in the war. I had no idea who Jews were, what Jews represented, but 6 million Jews died, but as a collateral damage of war. There were gypsies, there were Poles, there were other ethnic minorities, and who died in the war among the 70, 80 million people that died in that war. So that was kind of always looming in like a dark shadow that something happened, but it was a result of the war.
Because that's all they taught you in school, is that they just died in the war, not that it was at the hands
trying to this image, and you have to understand, when you're an elementary school student, what else can they tell you? And then came, and for me, I was 14 years old, and came the watershed moment for me and for my generation, the events of Munich 1972, the murder of the Israeli athletes in Munich by Palestinian terrorists. And the day after, everything changed. It was a headline in the newspaper that I never forget: Jews killed in Germany again, with a picture of the 2 helicopters in which the Israeli athletes were sitting dead. One burned out, the other, the Israelis, bodies of the Israelis slumped over the seat, shot death. And the questions had to be answered. And in school, we started to talk about it. When I asked my father what it means, Jews killed in Germany again, my father said it means nothing.
Back to you. After you realized what your father had been involved in, you examined your own faith. You moved to Israel and you convert to Judaism. What was it that made you say, I'm going to go 100% and convert into Judaism?
I met a group of Israelis, bonded with them, specifically the girls, and that attracted me a lot. And I found that we are alike. There is no difference. There is no racial difference, which my father still insisted. My father insisted there is racial difference between white people and the non-white people, and the Jews, of course. He was truly anchored in the racist ideology.
Indoctrined through
And
his
trying to
childhood.
indoctrinate me, and it didn't work for me because I wanted to see, I wanted to encounter. I visited Israel. I experienced Israel on a very emotional trip in 1978 through the eyes of my new gained friends. And I asked myself, first of all, there were two feelings that I had, guilt and shame. On the other hand, growing curiosity. How can it be that those people who suffered so tremendously can not only strike a relationship with me, build a relationship with me, but can start building families, building a new country, an old country, to rebuild the country, moving forward. There's a faith, there's a spirit in these people. I want to understand what that is, what makes them tick. And I became interested in Judaism, and in Germany I explored Judaism with the help of a small Jewish community that I joined as a Shabbos goy, I mean a non-Jew who was doing the chores in the Orthodox Jewish community. And that process, I grew into the life of Jews, came closer to Judaism, and it took me 7 years before I converted.
And obviously that created tension between you and your father more than it had previously existed. You say you lost touch with him after that. Do you have any regrets at this point, losing touch with your father and then ultimately losing him, not getting a chance to say goodbye?
Yes. The understatement is that we lost touch, we completely disconnected. We became strangers.
And this was because you chose to convert to Judaism?
It was because I distanced myself from him, physically and emotionally, spiritually. I couldn't even have a conversation with him. I wanted to build a new identity, for me to have my own value system. And when I left Germany for good, I never met him again. He died 6 months later. So yes, I am sorry. And yes, like a child loses his parent, I lost a father. And there's only one father you have in your life. And to rebuild this relationship, it was impossible. Or even to converse with him, it was impossible. Many, many years later, my now dead sister gave me a packet of letters that he sent to me, but never mailed. And I read them. And they gave me an insight in his psyche in the last 6 months of his life, from the bitterness that he lost me, to the desperation to contact me, and then to the resignation that I'm gone. And that gave me a closure in a certain sense, and visiting my parents' grave for the first time after 20 years.
Yeah, despite everything you've been through, the obvious religious and emotional differences you experienced with your father, you were able to find peace with the entire situation with your mother and your father. Was that something that you made a conscious decision to do? Is it something that you continue to have to work on every day?
I made a conscious decision because I'm a parent myself. As a father of 3 children, I could only develop a healthy relationship with my children by having a healthy relationship with my parents. Healthy in a sense that there must be a closure before you move forward. And this closure I achieved by just letting it out, by telling the truth for the first time, because I didn't talk about my life for many, many years. My children didn't know about it.
And so when you say you opened up, you told these stories to your children?
Well, I remember my son, he was 14 years old, he's now 23, when I told him the story because he asked me. He asked me who is my grandfather. He saw a picture, and I told him the story. And his reaction as a nice Jewish boy going to Jewish school, Jewish education, the whole 9 yards, he said, "That's a cool story, Dad."
And here you are coming full circle from the son of a Nazi tank commander. You now live here in South Florida. You practice family medicine.
That's
and
correct.
You're practicing Jew. It's an amazing story, and it certainly puts things in perspective. I think a lot of people who have family struggles, this is certainly a unique one. And if you're able to find closure and acceptance with your situation, I think a lot of people will find they'll be able to get over some things as well.
Amen. I hope.
All right, Dr. Bernd Wollschlaeger, thanks so much for being with us. Fascinating story. It's called A German Life. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.